Welcome to the Affirming Village Podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin-Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is one we didn't plan to record lightly because it hits close to home for so many families. We're talking about gaslighting at the IEP table, what it looks like, how it sounds, and why many parents may leave meetings questioning their own reality.
If you have ever walked out of an IEP meeting and all you can hear is Twilight Zone music in your head, then this episode is for you. Because what you're experiencing is not confusion, it's a pattern.
We are naming the subtle and not so subtle ways, conscious and not so conscious ways that schools can undermine parent concerns. From we don't see that here, to data being weaponized, to concerns being reframed as emotions instead of valuable information and honestly, observation and data.
And this isn't always about schools making honest mistakes. This can be about power. This is often about whose voice is believed, whose expertise is dismissed, and how systems protect themselves at the expense of children. It's also about trying to reassure when we should be listening and centering the learner's experience.
We're going to talk about why gaslighting happens, how it can disproportionately impact marginalized families, and how it can keep harmful practices in place while parents are just told to trust the process, or as I like to call it, wait and fail.
Right. Most importantly, we're going to remind you of this. Your observations are valid. Your lived experience matters, and you are not imagining the harm.
So take a breath, ground yourself, and let's talk about what gaslighting at the IEP table really looks like and how to recognize it when it's happening. And for my school staff, how to recognize it so that you aren't doing it and you're stopping your colleagues from doing it.
Yeah. So let's get into it because there's a lot to unpack here.
That part.
That part. And just so everybody who's listening knows, Destiny and I have been in this Zoom recording call for an extended period of time discussing this before we remembered to hit record. So we've already been swapping stories and trying to unpack this. And then it was like, oh, wait, we're supposed to actually hit record so that other people can hear this conversation. How do we want to start, Destiny? Because there's so many different ways to think about gaslighting, right? And it's like I think that there are moments and times where this is intentional strategy. Mm-hmm. And there are moments in time where it really isn't. It really is teams trying to reassure, trying to comfort, and they don't realize that what they are saying is completely dismissive and is fracturing trust in ways that they just don't realize what they're doing, and they don't realize they're hurting the learner. And they're really distinct experiences, and they can kind of be happening at the same time. You can have some team members that are really like showing up in earnest, and they actually do care, and they are really trying, and they hear the concern, and they're like, oh my goodness gracious, you don't need to worry about, right? They're coming from that angle. And right. At the same time, you can have folks sitting there saying garbage that is intentionally trying to weaponize and dismiss and deny access. It's very confusing.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of starting with where it's like where it can be unintentional is I have had learners where in the beginning of their educational career or in beginning of, so whether it's like pre-K or kindergarten or it's the beginning of just the school year, there's a lot of dysregulation. And so, especially for our younger learners, I've seen where so much dysregulation, right, prevents them from accessing the educational setting. It prevents them from accessing instruction, right? But at the same time, parents have maybe had a neuropsych done or they've just worked with their child and they've just seen there's maybe some academic struggles already looming early, right? Like reading.
Right.
And I've seen where the parents are just like, hey, like I'm concerned about dyslexia and, or I'm concerned about, decoding or blending. And, those are still skills to be built up. But at the same time, the school has just gotten like the dysregulation stabilized, right? And so they're like, well, maybe it's just they haven't been exposed to it. And so when the parent feels like I've kind of been monitoring this and the school hasn't had really the ability to monitor it because they've been heavy on trying to get the dysregulation regulated, the parent then will feel like they're gaslighting me, right? They'll feel like they don't want to do anything. They don't want to address this. They don't want to this, that, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes that's an example of, like when we talked about sometimes intentional, unintentional, where I, as the advocate, will tell the parent as well as the school team, we got to document, we have to communicate, we have to discuss where you're seeing your concerns, we have to discuss why they're not seeing those concerns. And that's my way of kind of bridging that gap and recognizing, and I say this as someone who was on the other side of this as a parent, and that, they have to be regulated to access. And so it's a situation where it's like, I don't see either side as being wrong. I think that both sides is just looking at it through a different lens. And so let's just document it and then monitor it and keep an eye on it. And so that's when we start looking at, oh, well, we are noticing that they're struggling with these letter sounds and these letters. And their peers are not, right? And so now it gets into like, maybe there is a concern there, but that's an example. I want to kind of start off with one, like you mentioned, where there can just be this miscommunication, but neither side is having ill intent. Neither side is trying to be dismissive, but they're looking at from a, let's say, a curriculum standard standpoint, and then from they're just now getting regulated standpoint of like, I do think that this learner is capable and will be able to do it once they have access to it. And that wasn't an ill-intended dismissing and just saying, I'm just assuming your learner can do it or trying to avoid providing that support.
Right. Yeah, no, the example I was sharing before we remembered to hit record was this happens a lot with learners who are struggling socially. Mm-hmm. And especially those kind of higher masking learners where the parents and caregivers are saying, hey, my kid is having a difficult time engaging with peers. I hear this all the time, and this was certainly our lived experience where the child is essentially being excluded, right? They're not invited to things. They don't really have a friend that they spend time with outside of the school setting. Oftentimes, to the parents' knowledge, they don't really have somebody they're consistently spending time with in the school setting, right? And I think that school staff in this situation often jump in to reassure, right? Like, oh gosh, no, Lisa is really well liked, and Lisa does have friends, and Lisa, right? And it is really coming from this good place. And I was sharing with Destiny that I literally just had a meeting with this where kind of opposite of your scenario, this learner started off the school year actually accessing learning, behavior stuff was at a minimum, right? Like, and what we were sort of hypothesizing is that his capacity was greater at the beginning of the year, and as the year has gone on, the toll has started to show itself, and his capacity has started to diminish. And the parents feel very strongly that part of the draw on his capacity, as I use the same word 600 times in one sentence, is that peers are starting to notice his differences
Mm-hmm.
and are starting to make that known to him. So he's on the receiving end of some not so kind comments, some not so kind actions. And kids, can be subtle about these things, subtle enough that the adults don't necessarily pick up on it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really weighing heavily on the target of
Mm-hmm.
who's the person on the receiving end.
Right.
And so, the dysregulation's been much higher. And, this young person's been getting, I'm using air quotes, getting in more trouble and like all the things. And they're all kind of scratching their heads going, gosh, what's going on? And so when the parents brought this concern up at a meeting recently, one of the school team members jumped in and said, oh my goodness, he's got two friends that he spends a lot of time with and other kids like it. And I know with 100% certainty that that team member was trying to reassure that
Mm-hmm.
no, 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 your kid is really well liked. At some point, she backed off and was like, I just didn't know that this was right. And so there was some humility that
Mm-hmm.
came in, but it was borderline on too little too late
Mm-hmm.
because when the first reaction to a concern is to reassure,
Mm-hmm.
in most situations, the parents are hearing, you're not listening to me. You're not taking this concern, right? They don't feel well held most of the
Mm-hmm.
time. And so it's this real mismatch where I don't think anybody is intending anything harmful, but it really fractures trust. And then the parents are like, well, why do I want to say anything? Y'all aren't listening anyway.
Absolutely. And I mean, and it's not because it's essentially I'm bringing this concern to you and you're dismissing it. And
Right.
that's not always the intent, but sometimes it is. And
Sometimes it is.
what I really talk a lot about is that a lot of times when I'm hired by a family, and I've said this in many episodes, advocates are hired for different reasons. Sometimes I'm simply hired because the parent feels unheard. And so that comes with that validation. Like I feel like I'm being gaslit. And as a mental health professional, I'm the first person to say that the term gaslighting gets used way too much in society these days. Everything is used as gaslighting. And mental health professionals are like, no, please don't. That's not what that is. Like, that's just somebody giving their opinion. That's just somebody stating this or that. But when I see it in the educational setting, and specifically when I see it in the IEP meetings, right, is it's I'm bringing you a valid concern that I have evidence for, right? This is not something I suspect. I'm able to give you instances and situations where this has occurred, but because you haven't witnessed it or you view it differently or you don't agree with it because you may be personalizing it and bringing ego to the table,
That
you
part.
are gaslighting me into believing that it's not happening. And if you guys haven't, please go back to part 1 of season 1 and listen to our episode or watch our episode where we talk about what happens when ego, is at the table and bias is at the table. But, you know, part of that gaslighting, I think, in my experience that I've seen and experienced both as a parent and as an advocate supporting families, is sometimes that ego is in the room about whether or not we are keeping the learner safe, educating the learner, supporting the learner. And so instead of acknowledging that what the parent is saying could be valid or that you just haven't witnessed it, it becomes this situation of the parent having to prove that something is going on, and also subsequently, like you mentioned, not shut down and stop talking about this issue that is a very real issue that is happening.
Right. 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 No, absolutely. As you were talking, I was thinking about, because my brain decided to go to dark places. When it's intentional. And the ways that I have several situations that are all like jumping up in my head at the same time, and they're all totally related because it's the same district. um, is when there's like a common practice. So Destiny and I several years ago were part of the same kind of mentorship. program, and there was like a conference or retreat conference, I guess is the right word. And one of the very first questions posed at that conference was, what's the difference between a law, a policy, and a habit? And this mentorship had like folks in it who sit at all sort of seats at an IEP table. So you were asked to sit at a table with administrators and teachers and related service providers and parents, right? So that you were having conversations with folks with multiple and varied perspectives, right? And I think what happens a lot in special education is that, and this is where we can extend a little bit of grace, is that there are some folks that think the well ingrained habit is actually law or policy, right? And this is where you can have multiple people at a table saying the same thing. And there's some folks at the table that actually know that this is garbage, but they're continuing the narrative. And then you have folks at the table that actually think this is how it's supposed to be. And so they're saying the same thing, but it's more with earnest, right? They don't realize that it could be
right.
different.
That's what's been ingrained and taught to them. Yeah.
Right. And so if districts as a whole, or school sites as a whole, but really districts, have sort of a long-term history of engaging in certain practices. And so like one example I'll use, and I'm obviously not going to name the district, but they really are stuck on ridiculous when it comes to para support. Right. And so they have it literally written. I'm not going to read it, but it's so bad. The parent screenshot the Skia eval and sent it to me. So I have like the actual language, but again, I'm not going to read it because it.
And for our non-California.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
What's a Skia?
Skia stands for Special Circumstances Instructional Aid. So it's a fancy word for paraprofessional or a one-on-one or individual intensive services or additional adult support. I mean, it could be called a million things for an additional adult to work one-on-one with your learner. And so there is an entire paragraph, I swear to God, of like all the things that are wrong with having this additional support. How it hurts the learner, all the different ways, right? That they won't have access to the classroom and they won't have access to the curriculum and they won't have access to it's such trash. Destiny is looking at me. If you are not watching this on YouTube, her face right now is perfect. I'm going to send it to you so that you can see it because it's so terrible. But to me, that is a form of like intentional gaslighting. Like, I'm denying your learner access to this service that they actually probably require. But I'm telling you in black and white on the form, on the assessment form, why you don't want it. It's danger, 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 danger. And it's like, I'm going to get political.
So it's our podcast. We can say what we want.
I'm sure you all have heard the expression that every accusation is an admission. With this current administration, kind of felt that way when I read it, right? Like, you just don't want to pay for this.
Right. Just say that.
Just say that part. Right? Don't try to scare the crap out of parents that your children will never have any friends and they'll be totally isolated and they won't be able to access the curriculum and like all the things in writing. Like the parent sent it to me and was like, what the hell is this? And I was like, a whole heap of bullshit. That's what that is. That's a whole heap of predetermined bullshit.
Which is why I'm like, did they not run this past an attorney?
It's in the documentation.
But no, but I think you're talking about, because we said we're going to talk about like some of the, biggest ways in which we see gaslighting occur. And I think you just brought up a number of points that come to mind. One, if anyone has listened to our podcast, follows me on social media at all, you know how passionate I am about the one-to-one topic.
Right.
My son has a one-to-one and he's in gen ed and I'm getting a little emotional. And he is doing excellent, like excelling, like beautifully. And the way in which I have stepped into in the past 2 weeks, stepped into IEP meetings and had to explain that a one-to-one is not a placement concerns me because the person
Sure.
saying it's a placement is the director and the program specialist and the compliance specialist from the district. So that's one. But two, when you talk about putting it on the paperwork, I have seen where parents are given district forms.
Right.
And these district forms already set up this narrative that goes against what parents have read, discussions they have had with advocates or other parents or other providers or the educators themselves. Because there are educators out there that are telling their parent, go get an advocate because
Right.
they see how the district is gaslighting them.
That's
And
correct.
then the parents, or my favorite is when they don't put it in black and white, they have a conversation with the parent. I then come to the meeting and they replicate said conversation. And I'm like, did you not hear what my role is? That you're repeating this? Um, and
You're
so
like, thank
I
you
think,
for the perfect lob.
right. I'm like, are you serious? So I've had so many times where I have shut down gaslighting in meetings.
Right.
And you're right. It is because it is a habit and it's something that, again, I've said things where the special education teacher is going like, oh, because they didn't know it was a habit. They thought
Right.
it was a policy
That's
because the
correct.
people above them made it seem like a policy. And so, and I think when we talk about gaslighting, I would definitely say one of the number ones that I come across is the one-to-one. I mean,
Oh yeah.
that
Oh,
they just don't
100%.
want to admit they just don't. And even when I make posts about it, and I do it frequently, and then when people tick me off, I make another one. And people will be in the comments and explicitly state like it's because they don't have the money. And I'm like, no shit. I'm like, I'm like, that's my point though, is like, just be honest
Right.
instead of gaslighting the parent into thinking that their learner doesn't need it and it wouldn't be beneficial. Now, there are times, and I say this all the time, I've had discussions with parents. The second one of my parents tells me they think their learner needs a one-on-one, we talk it out
Well,
because
sure.
sometimes we don't. Sometimes it is about the support they're already not receiving consistently,
Sure.
or need to tweak their support. But there are genuine situations where they would benefit from a one-on-one and the data is there.
That is correct.
And that's when it's like, okay, we need to get this documented and get this on record because they are trying to gaslight you. And it always starts with that statement of it is restrictive. Nobody wants someone following them around. They're not learning any skills. They're never going to be able to be independent. They're not going to be able to be in gen ed if you want them to have a one-to-one. All these lies. And
Right.
my favorite thing is to just shut it down because I point out that my child is in gen ed full time and has a one-to-one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, 100%. No, I see it a lot in the one-to-one conversation. I also see like the stalling
Mm-hmm.
at the eligibility,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like before you even have gotten in the door. And so the example I'll share from this is I come from like everybody in my family basically is a public school teacher. And my aunt, who falls in the category of repeating the narrative but having no clue that like she's wrong, right? So she wasn't like spinning the web, she was just repeating, right? And so she taught at the same school for like 39 years. And elementary. And back in the day when we were trying to get my daughter found eligible, which took a year, my aunt just kept saying, oh, well, you have to have an SST, which is a student study team. No, you don't. You do not. If you make a request for an IEP evaluation in writing, you do not have to have an SST first and go through all this rigmarole, right? Like it's a wait and fail. I'm changing from wait and see to wait and fail because that is
Mhm.
100% more accurate. And
Mhm.
she was just like, no, 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 you have to, you have to, you have to. And I'm like, I didn't know enough at the time, even though I knew that she was wrong.
Mhm. Mhm.
So jump many moons later, and without disclosing details because I don't want to identify family members, but like a family member, they were exploring potential special ed.
Mhm.
And she's again said something like about the SST and something, the narrative of you have to be at least 2 years behind.
Mhm.
That one, right?
That's a
And
common one. That's a
that's
common
the
one.
common one, right? And I said, oh, no, you don't. And she was like, well, when did that change? I said, it never was, right? And now I'm having this conversation. It's not about me, it's about
Uh-huh.
somebody else where there's enough degrees of separation. And like, I don't know how much she heard or didn't hear, but like, she perpetuated harm completely unintentionally for
Right.
however many years she did, repeating, oh, you have to be at least 2 years behind, and oh, you have to start with this SST process, because as the general educator, that was what the system and the folks around her told her. Now, at the
Mhm.
time we had this later conversation, she was long retired, but it was
Right,
just
right,
like
right.
this kind of aha moment of like, it doesn't. Right?
Mhm.
Like I was in an IEP meeting the other day with a district that is ED happy.
Mm.
In some states, it's emotional disability, in others, it's emotionally disturbed. My favorite,
Emotionally, behaviorally disturbed. Yeah.
emotionally, behaviorally disturbed, even better.
Mhm.
Right? And
Mhm.
this district is just real high on any learner that expresses, like, demonstrates any dysregulation or quote unquote behavior or anxiety or anything. That's the category, right?
Mhm.
And I was sitting at the table, like the psychologist, was doing their thing. And I remember sitting there thinking, as this person was talking, if I was the parent and didn't have the experience that I've now had as an advocate, I would
Mhm.
literally not know how to respond to your review of your report, because it was pointing to data, it was pointing to forms the parents had filled out, they were pointing out like all of these kind of higher scores in the emotional dysregulation, anxiety, blah 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 type stuff. If
Mhm.
I didn't know better, I would think, oh well, okay, the data says it has to be ED, except I do know better because I happen to be in the position that I'm in. And so I was able to say, like, I appreciate that. And, right, like, it's a district
So
I'm really
classy.
familiar with. So I was like, I know it's common practice in this district. However, like, everywhere else, not everywhere else, but lots of other places, when scores like this come back, the eligibility consideration is either autism or OHI, other health impairment. And the program specialist, like, it felt like a really earnest and honest reaction, was like, really? And I was like, yeah, really? Like, just because you all do something poorly doesn't mean that everybody else does it poorly, right? But it's like even the district level person seemed genuinely surprised that there was a different way to do it. And so it's this, like, you're trying to juggle so many things as the parent and even as the educator, right? Like I had a different meeting last week where, like, we are really having a conversation with the district office, but like the entire team was in the room, but
Mhm.
the entire team really didn't speak the language of what was being discussed. And it was like a conversation that had to happen, but like, and so they were earnestly like trying to answer the questions, but the district level person that was there, like, finally figured out like what the parents were trying to get clarity on,
Mhm. Mhm.
and did not want to answer the question because they didn't want to be locked into an answer. And so they just let the team sit and spin. It was the most uncomfortable meeting I've ever been in my life. It was exceedingly painful. Anyway, that was a little bit of a sidebar. But I think that there are times where, like, you have to hold space, this is such a huge ask of, like, intent, impact. How do I respond? Right? Like, do I always have to hold the intent of the person? Do I just get to say this feels crappy and lousy and like name it? And like, when am I supposed to hold the humanity of everybody at the table? And when am I supposed to say, we're freaking hurting my kid and I've had it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, and in the cases where it, like the para garbage language in the, in the report, or, oh, it has to be this particular eligibility category, or they have to be 2 years behind, or, oh, that's whatever, where it feels more like a system gaslighting effort, um, like, where you walk out of the meeting and all you want to scream at the top of your lungs is, this just sounds like a whole bunch of fucking bullshit, but you don't know anything else to say, then this is just absolutely ridiculous. Right? Like,
Yes.
in the moments where you feel like somebody's trying to be kind, but they're missing the mark, it's almost not that, like, you don't freeze in those moments, but you can sort of unfreeze more quickly. But when you feel like the whole system is coming at you, it's really difficult to not, like, certainly in the parent role, to not be like, I don't know what's wrong here. I just know something is wrong here, because whatever just came out of your mouth smells like shit.
Yeah. I mean, you hit so many things. My brain is like going all over the place because I think one, when you talked about like the report and the looking at the ED category and clearly seeing how the district personnel was like, really? One that leans on something that I touched on in a reel recently of, mental health professionals, which you put, psychologists and school counselors in this category as well, when you're talking about the school setting, even though sometimes they also don't have a mental health actual credential, um, they guide that heavily, right? It's rare that you're going to see district personnel disagree with a school psychologist's report, right? We're a team. The district is a team. We're collaborative. And also, that's not my area, right?
Right, right.
So, and I think that's the biggest piece. Parents can get really wrapped into the whole team part of the school against home and miss the part of like, that's not my area. My area is supposed to be to understand the law and the criteria. And if they're completing this report and saying they qualify under this criteria, then they qualify under this criteria. So I think you're talking about that piece where everyone is not, does not have the ability to not have bias or subjectivity. And so sometimes that standardized and objective mixes with the subjective, and that becomes a district practice. And it really ends up being in line with, in black and white, the district policy. And it's two different things that have to be teased out. And that's when the gaslighting of the parent can occur.
Right.
The other thing that you were mentioning that just sparked for me of just thinking about, like you said, this district being heavy and not naming the district on ED is thinking about, and I'm going to call the whole state out, the state of Georgia, which is where I am. I would never specify a district, just like Lisa did. I would never do that. But the state of Georgia has a whole dyslexia roadmap, right?
Right.
For addressing dyslexia. And recently they passed a law in regards to removing the way in which reading was taught with a specific old undata provided. And it was basically almost like a I can't remember what it was exactly called, but it was almost like the learner was essentially like guessing to try and figure out the reading. And it's an old modality, and many states had already said, you cannot use this to teach reading. And we're in the South. And so we were still using it. And so one of the lawmakers that has children really pushed like to get that gone. And I was like, okay, great, awesome. But in the state of Georgia, they have an issue with specific learning disability. Like they
Oh,
have an
interesting.
issue
Okay.
with qualifying learners for that category of eligibility. And this is known. Anyone who has a child with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, they run into barriers of them not wanting to put this specific learning disability category on there often until it is too late. And when I
Do
say
you
too
know
late,
what the thinking behind that is? And
so I am not sure. I do know in the state of Georgia, category of eligibility for developmental delay goes up to 9. So
okay,
I do know already there's really this push not until after 9 to move them out of that category,
sure.
which I don't have an issue with because I do have concern that they will put them in the ED category.
Sure, sure, sure.
And
You can
because
spell
they
that
haven't
out.
addressed the regulation piece, which is very common in special education learners,
Right.
for them not to address it if it is there. And if it's externally there and evident, let me be clear about that, because a lot of times it's internal. But so that is a well-known issue in Georgia for anyone that's in special education. Like it's like you fight tooth and nail. You get a private evaluation, you bring it to the school, and the school psychologist will still sit there and look you in your face and say, well, we're not seeing it because they're doing this with iReady or they're doing this or that. And so that to me, and I've seen it in different states for sure. But that to me is another level of gaslighting, right? Because again, we go back to I went, and a lot of times the parents going out of pocket because I want to be clear. A lot of insurance companies do not cover educational evaluations. They'll cover a neuropsych, which can have the potential to identify those barriers academically, depending on your learner's age, right? But not academic educational testing, specifically looking at dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia.
Right.
And so then they bring this to the school, and the school is just like, we're not seeing that. Like they're reading fine, or they're a lot of peers mess this up or that up. And that's one of the ones that I really am just like, if it were your child. And that's one, and that's like what I just that statement is what I really want to throw back when I hear that. Because
Right.
I mean, and my youngest learner struggles with reading, and he's very open about this. So I'm not sharing anything that he would not share. He'll tell anyone that he comes across. So we're working on that, but he'll
He's a
tell
stick.
anyone. Like he just said it in the restaurant the other day when we were looking at the menu. But he was also
He's
very
like,
proud
I don't
of the
know about
amount of
all
words
this.
he read recently with his reading specialist. So he was super excited about that. And then that's why he also said he didn't want to then read the menu because he was like, I already did my reading for today. So,
Fair enough. Fair enough. He's like, I'm
but
tapped out.
but the thing about it is that when you come across that, you immediately go into problem solving mode, do this, do that. And a lot of parents will fight tooth and nail and push tooth and nail to, even if they have to scrape, do payment plan, right, to get this private evaluation. And I've seen so many times where the parent then brings that to the school and the school looks them in the face and says, there's not, yes, excuse me, let me back that up. They never say there's nothing wrong, but they'll say RTI is covering it, or we're doing this group intervention that's covering it. And that's another, before I throw it back to Lisa, because I know she has many things on this one too. Another thing I was thinking when you were talking about like kind of the boxes that need to be checked when they delay evaluations, another thing I was thinking about was RTI. I can't tell you how many times the parents come to me and they say, well, they said we have to do RTI before we can do a special education evaluation. And me and Lisa are not attorneys, but you can go to IDEA, and that is not true. And IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that governs all special education. And I don't care what state you're in, I don't care what district policy that they have. You cannot deny a special education evaluation because you are implementing RTI.
And RTI stands for response to intervention.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm curious. I'm like, like intrigued me here. and we'll leave it in the state of Georgia just because you used that example.
Right.
Obviously, this won't hold true for all situations, but are you seeing, it sounds like you're seeing more of the scenario where they're like, oh, yeah, well, we see that, yeah, there's some, struggles here, there, or whatever, but like it hasn't yet hit the need for tier 3 support, so they don't need the IEP. We're just going to keep them in this, non-special education level. So we're going to deny eligibility, or we're going to even deny doing an evaluation in the first place. Are you seeing that scenario more than the like, yeah, we see that, but we actually feel like, I'm going to make this up, VADHD and the executive functioning differences are really what's more primary, and we just feel like OHI is better. And since eligibility category doesn't drive or determine services, like we're going to check this box and we're going to ignore that box. Like, what's sort of the, from your experience, like the directionality that teams tend to go?
I'm seeing a mix in that I am seeing on the one hand where if they do not have an IEP or a 504 and their grades are not reflective of failing, then it's almost like they fly under the radar until they get higher up. And then we're starting to see dysregulation
Sure.
because they don't have that academic foundation. So I'm seeing that. And then I'm also seeing where they do have an IEP. It is a lot of times for OHI. They are a lot of times ADHD. The parent has suspected learning disability of the learner. They then have like done some research, sought it out, sometimes got a private evaluation, sometimes can't afford a private evaluation. So we're really trying to push the school to do it. The school is downplaying it, but subsequently stating that the intervention being provided is not addressing the issue. And then if they have had a private evaluation, they are not documenting that private evaluation results in the IEP. So then the category does matter in that instance because you're not addressing the need.
The
So
identified
I
area.
have seen, and I actually was able to get my son started for the evaluation process in that regard because everyone was open and honest about this intervention was going on for a year and we're still in the same spot.
Right.
And so, and again, I always say, and I always tell my families, I don't know if that's because I am an advocate. They know I'm an advocate, right?
It's not hurting your
Right,
situation.
right. So it's like my request and my want for my children is it's different because I am seen at a different level than some parents. And it shouldn't be that way, but I know that it is for a fact.
Right. Sure.
Open my mouth and
Sure.
say something and they're gonna listen. It's like and that's just how it is. And
Right.
but it's very much something that is very much of a deficit to the learners because I just saw something the other day that said like we can already tell by age 5. I saw this and I was like, I got to read this article that there are reading struggles.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, but for people that are not immersed in that, right, you wouldn't know that. But you have people commenting that are reading intervention specialists that are like, yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like, again, just another level of that gaslighting where
Right. Oh,
you
100%. That's so
feel
triggering of a memory.
crazy because you're like, or like with one of the things with my oldest who is autistic, and this is known, and we talk about this, and he knows this. So know anything that we share about our children, they are aware that we are sharing. So we don't in any way go against their confidentiality. But the whole reason I became an advocate, like one of the things that I was gaslit about was that he was autistic. I had already had
Oh,
the
sure. Of
evaluation
course.
done, and the school said, no, this is a choice. He's just choosing to do this. And they put him under developmental delay. and then subsequently said he didn't need pragmatics with speech because the speech therapist said he has language. And I was like, no shit. I was like, but social situations are a struggle for him. I'm like, I have witnessed it. I have helped facilitate them. We have had conversations about it where he is disconnected and is not seeing what is happening or why that's happening. And then we get to the new school and the speech language pathologist comes in to assess because the special education teacher at the new school is like, Mom and Dad, what are your thoughts about pragmatics? And we're like, yes. And we do it. And there's all types of barriers to his pragmatic language skills.
Sure.
And to be clear, I'm a big person too on pragmatics goes into collaborative problem solving and
Yes.
regulation and how we view social scenarios and situations and how we understand other people's point of views while also self-advocating for ourselves. And that's what that means from a neuroaffirming standpoint. It doesn't mean the old, you have to do social this way. It means that helping us
No.
have our voice and subsequently understand why others respond the way they do. And so that's the way that I was gaslit. And
Yeah. Yeah.
had I not been a mental health professional, I would not have went the route I went, but I was just absolutely like, you're freaking wrong. And that's that.
And that is that. Yeah, no, I had a family I was sharing with Destiny before we hopped into this or hit record, I should say. We'd hopped into the call. We just hadn't hit record yet. I had a family reaching out that kind of had this epiphany because they've been going 12 rounds with their team about their learner, and they just sort of had this moment this morning of like the reason why we're at an impasse is they don't believe me, right? They don't believe that my child is neurodivergent, that the challenges that they're demonstrating in the school environment are a function of disability.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they don't believe me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, as I laughed with Destiny, rambling on in voice messaging, which I tend to do. Um, Sharing with this parent that like it's such a painful realization to like get to that place, but and I've said this many times probably on this podcast too, but certainly on Instagram, is that one strategy that I think can be helpful in a number of different scenarios, but in this one as well, is inquiry. So if you're in a place where like you're feeling like you're not being believed and that the team is really feeling like there's some level of like willfulness, right? Like Destiny, what you were sharing, what you were experiencing with your oldest in his younger early elementary years is like, no, he's just choosing this and that. Well, no, he wasn't choosing anything. And so you were at a place where you and not the teacher I know was wonderful, so I always want to give her props. But the administration was like, no, he can't be doing this, and you were like, I don't know what's going on, but I don't think he's choosing to do anything, and that's not landing right. So you're like kind of going like this, right, button heads. And I think this is happening in the scenario is, kind of my advice to this really wonderful parent was to just start asking questions like, okay, so what are you observing? What are you witnessing in your classroom? Are there patterns to it? What do you imagine is kind of going on for this learner, right? Or for my child, right? At these times. And, I think in this situation and probably in lots of situations where you're kind of having this impasse and the team is sort of stuck on the learner is choosing to do something and that choice feels inconsistent. And so then it starts to feel manipulative and like all the things to the adults that are sort of stuck in that older ableist mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or I should say outdated ableist mindset. I'm older, so I can like misspeak that way, I guess,
This is true.
or maybe
This is
not.
true.
Anyway, is to acknowledge that, like, yeah, I get it, right? Like, because the explanation might go along the lines of it feels like they're choosing in one moment to do the thing, and then the next day or the next 10 minutes they're like, no, I'm not doing this anymore, I want, right? So it feels like there's refusal, it feels like there's pushback, it feels like there's, and sometimes educators take that kind of thing personally. And I think that when you ask and then they share and then your response is something along the lines of like, I get it, it happens in my home, I
Mm-hmm.
understand feeling like there's some willfulness happening, right? But I do think it's really important that we recognize that while it might look like manipulation, or it might look like a threat, or it might look like, defiance or whatever, that it really truly is a can't, not a won't. And then
Mm-hmm.
I like to take it a whole step further, which is to center the learner and their experience in it and say, imagine what it must feel like for them to be able to do something in one moment and not be able to get their body to do it in the next, right? To be able to focus and access and learn and engage in one moment and then not really understand all the pieces of the landscape that have changed, that are
Mm-hmm.
now preventing me from be able to do what I literally just did. And how disquieting and confusing and overwhelming that must be for the learner themselves. Because
Mm-hmm.
I really do truly feel that nobody goes into education to intentionally harm children.
Right.
But that does not mean that harm does not happen. And so if we can somehow alter the perspective, it's not about you and your teaching or your administrating or your whatever. It's not about me and my parenting, right? It's not about my kid trying to be a pain in the ass, right? Imagine how scary that must feel to not be able to trust what your body is doing, to trust that like you could do something one day but you can't do it the next day, right? To feel like you're being whiplashed. That must be a really disquieting experience. Can we put our heads together and see if we can figure out the patterns to it? If we can figure out what some of those barriers are so that we can be more accommodating and meeting the learner in the ways they need to be met so that they are more consistently able to demonstrate what they know or access the learning or engage with their community in ways that feel meaningful to them, and that there's a dial down of the resistance or that whatever it is that you're seeing, right? How are we thinking about sensory? How are we thinking about nervous system needs? How are we thinking about their motor differences? How are we thinking about all the things and getting like, can we just stick a pin in the blame game,
Mm-hmm.
please? I'm
No,
asking
but
you.
I think what you're talking about is when essentially, and I know you've done this in meetings, and I often find myself doing this as the neurodivergent person in the room, especially for my autistic learners, is reframing the situation and bringing in a different perspective for consideration. And so, on top of asking those questions, it's saying, and I'll even just say, hey, just let's maybe, what if it was, right? I've seen where I know as an autistic, my autistic learner has, my ADHD learner has, as an ADHD or I, right? Another thing that I think that you're getting to that I think is so important too is that when we're reframing it, I will point out an adult situation
Yes.
that helps them connect to why I'm saying what I'm saying. And one
Right.
of the things I've pointed out is like when talking about comfort items and saying, like, some of us, if we don't have our coffee and our pens and our planner and our phone and our specific lanyard, like we're like out of sorts. This is what I need. This is what makes me comfortable. This is what helps me navigate my day. If we don't have our Dr. Pepper, like I have a best friend, Dr. Pepper is her jam. Like it's like if we don't have these certain things, that throws us off. And it's coming to them, I say, from a very basic level of seeing
Sure.
how the things that comfort you when referring to comfort items, or like that, but more elevated for this learner because of the nervous system safety and the need to regulate and still learning how to regulate and be in spaces that are uncomfortable. Similar to when talking about, perception and capacity, right? Because we always talk about capacity, is like Monday, you might be like, I just came off a 4 day. I'm ready to go. Let's do it. I'm refreshed. And then I'm like, and by Friday, you're like, is it the weekend yet? Like if we could just watch movies and not do any lessons or any teaching today. And what I find is that when you can reframe for them and make it seem realistic, then they tend to have more of a connection and understanding to what you're saying. There's more of a
Right.
consideration. And one of the things too is that I always caution parents against. Parents will learn terms that they can't really weed through. They don't really know the full scope and definition, how it may apply to their learner.
Right.
But they've read enough to be like, this applies to my learner. One that comes to mind is PDA. And
Oh,
so they
sure.
step into the IEP meeting and they won't have a full grasp on the PDA term or conversation. And they will immediately bring it up, and the team will immediately go like, okay, this is some unresearched, like they all these things that come to mind for them. And so one of the things I've talked, because we're talking about like how to address gaslighting and stuff, I always have my family start with anxiety and regulation. I have them, unless you have someone like a Lisa or a Jessica Hanzo in the room, like I'm like, start with what gravitated you towards that.
Right.
Start with what is able to be more translatable. Now you will have, I have one team where the director is familiar with PDA. The director is very, and so PDA training was completely identified and allowed and all those things. That's a
Right.
rarity. And so,
Yeah, it's definitely not the norm. It's not the norm. Yeah, I mean, not to interrupt you, but where I tend to start is that the learner has like a strong drive for autonomy,
mhm,
and that they just have kind of a sensitive nervous system, and their brain is essentially hardwired to kind of pick up on threat in the environment. And so if their brain perceives that they're losing their autonomy, or they feel like somebody's kind of trying to control the situation, and they feel like they're kind of losing their footing a bit, then we see these stress responses that occur. And so it's not that I don't name PDA sometimes, but I mean, I had somebody somewhat recent, like a couple weeks ago. I don't want to say she was hostile, but she was borderline on hostile. And it was a school psychologist, and she was like, I don't even know what this is. I mean, it was like if she had a paper in her hand, she would have thrown it and been like, I don't know what this is, right? Like it was that kind of energy. Um, and it was off-putting. And so it was one of those moments where it's like, okay, we're not going to get her on board using like a definition, and we definitely don't want to like, she's the school psychologist, right? So I don't want to expose her for not being knowledgeable. So I'm going to back it up and just say, like, in practical terms, this is kind of what this young person's experience is like, and where those stressors are. And, anyway, I totally interrupted you and I didn't mean to. But yeah, no, there's
no,
times I
no,
agree with
you're
you. Like,
no. What you said though is really speaks to that, and that's important to talk about those because we're talking about not just the ways in which we've seen gaslighting occur, but we're also talking about like how you can bring another perception and solution to that. And so we've talked about inquiry, we've talked about like looking at bringing in that adult perspective, consideration of alternate perspectives. But you're also talking about when you build that research, right? And and again, like I said, you not everyone knows, not everyone will know a certain topic the same way, but sometimes it is that approach of like recognizing, okay, this is a person that we might need to get on the board. We might need them to understand and not gaslight. And in my opinion, I am very preferable to the like, I don't know what that is, or I haven't heard of that.
Oh, sure. I
Right.
have absolutely.
Because it lets me know already the battle we're combating, right? Which is on the other side of you just not knowing it is like you being up on current information as it relates to disabled learners.
Right.
So,
Right. And as I completely tone police in my brain, right, in my nervous system,
mm-hmm.
I'm going to have a very different response to something that has more of a curiosity to it. Like, gosh, I don't know what that is. And like, right,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to respond better to that than like, I don't even know what this is, like paper toss, right? Like, you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm the school psychologist, or I'm the big wiggity dig at the
Right, right.
table.
Because
And like,
that's too very, I mean, I got told at an IEP meeting that like clearly you don't know how to write goals. And I was just like, okay. Well, that's not true. And I kept going with what I was saying. And like the school team was like, because like it was their supervisor, and they were like, oh my gosh, like you could tell they'd never even seen her respond that way. And it was like, because she got dysregulated because
sure.
she was being challenged. And and it was just
Right.
like, okay, um, whatever.
You're like,
But
tell me more about that. I'm gonna have a
right,
sip of
and
my
like
drink.
I'm gonna get into my background with writing goals. Like I had to get goals written, like that had to be approved by insurance companies. So I don't even want to hear that. But I think the biggest piece as we head towards like wrapping up this episode is just that gaslighting absolutely occurs at the IEP table. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's rooted in district practice, and which is not district policy. That does not mean that district policy is also not harmful. It doesn't mean that it also does not facilitate gaslighting. And in that case, I'm really thinking of like when we start looking at like code of conduct and behavior policies that are inherently ableist, and
Right.
impact special education learners. But there are ways to name it in a way that gets questions asked and answered, and that gets things documented.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that's a really
Absolutely.
important piece I wanted to bring in, um, was documentation, making sure you're having your perception of a situation and your learner's perception of a situation documented accurately, and how that differs from the school team's perception of the situation. And even if there is not a collaborative way to address the differences in perception, it is documented in case there is an issue down the line when there is a difference in the perception. And something that comes to mind is like getting your learner to school. And I've lived
Oh
that
yeah.
situation for
Yeah,
sure.
for
And it
sure.
definitely benefited to have it documented what I was considering to be the issue versus them. And then we were able to collaborate to support.
Yeah. No, and I don't want to keep us dragging on, but I had two thoughts. Let's see if I can hold on to them. I think a lot of the strategies that we discussed in this conversation lean more towards situations where the gaslighting isn't necessarily intending harm, and that, there's sort of room for repair and
Right.
like continued collaboration. When it's more like this intentional, no, here we put kids on ED, or here we don't do specific learning disability, or right, it's a whole different kind of game and maybe a whole different episode. But the documentation piece is really key and critical in those situations. And just to name a couple of strategies, just so folks don't feel like they're walking away from this conversation like, hey, I'm experiencing the not good. What do I
Mm-hmm.
do? Is to ask for policy, right? If something really isn't feeling right. Like I had a team one time, this was a couple of years ago, say we have to seclude and restrain. I was like, says who? Right? We're gonna need to, it's the law. I was like, could you please provide? That is news to me. Could you please provide? Right. And then, of
I
course,
love when they say, well, we'll just call. Well, then we'll just have to call you every time an issue
no,
arises.
I need a link. I
Fine.
need the whole thing. Please. Right. And you don't have to be like awful about it. It's just like, whoo,
Oh yeah, I
that's
say,
gonna
okay, I
be,
wasn't aware that was the policy. If you could please provide my client
yeah,
policy
yeah,
via email, and you'll see how quickly it
100%.
becomes a, oh, it's not a policy.
It's not a policy. It's our really bad practice. Really, that's weird. But thank you so much for telling me in writing. Like a big Cheshire cat grin. Thanks so much. But also a strategy that I use, especially if it's like an eligibility kind of situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I've talked about this on social media before, but I don't know if I have on the podcast. I don't know what I've done ever, actually. Is to use their reports to draw the conclusion that should have been drawn.
That's great.
Right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like in the example of them of a state essentially leaning away from specific learning disability, but the data is there to show that like these test scores, this whatever, all lines up with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's certain eligibility categories where that's an easier
Right,
kind of
right,
argument to make.
right.
But you use their data and reframe it to say, hey, we need to reconsider because using all of your observation testing, da 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 da, like report from teacher, like it all lines up. And I have actually been fairly successful doing that. Not always, because nothing is always. But there is a little bit of leverage when you're not coming in and going, this outside report, not that outside reports can't be
Right.
helpful, or this is what's happening at home. Like, I'm not saying those are bad strategies. I think they round out a picture. But when you can use the actual data that the school has collected, whether it's through an evaluation report, whether it's through like disciplinary type stuff, right? Like, there are ways to kind of say, hey, y'all have collected this stuff and maybe are thinking about it a little bit differently, but here's a way. This is how I'm interpreting what you have done. Can we come back and revisit this? That feels a little bit more powerful than this is a whole heap of crap and what the hell,
Absolutely.
right? Um, so that was, I wanted to speak to that. And then the other thing I wanted to say, I'm like, should I already say it? The other thing I wanted to say is sometimes, especially in a situation where it's more the reassuring or just regurgitating stuff that folks don't really realize is super problematic, or in the
Mm-hmm.
situation of like, I don't believe you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is probably somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
The longer we don't kind of reconcile and come to a more shared understanding, the harder it's going to get, right? Because if a school team is grounded in their perspective that um, this is learner choice or this is willful or bad behavior, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's like if they've sung that song for long enough, now you're having to really deal with somebody's hubris because it's going to be that much harder for them to admit they were wrong. Right. And that's why I like to try to interrupt it as quickly as possible to say, hey, I appreciate that perspective. I had that perspective too, as before I was really learning and understanding, and I still struggle sometimes, right? Like, because it like cues safety to them that it's okay to change your mind. I did too. Even if you didn't, right? Like, right? But we're all learning. And so it's a cue to safety, like it's okay. You don't have to be perfect. Because the longer it goes on, the harder and harder it's going to be for them to say, shit, I've been part of a cycle of harm. And that is a really hard mirror to look in.
Absolutely. I want you to be honest, but I need you to recognize that your perception and your take may be flawed.
Right.
100%.
Right. Those are the
So,
things I wanted to say before I forgot.
No, I think that's really good though, because you really speak to situations. I mean, we do tackle. We do tackle situations where, again, there is that ill intent, and you have to look at how to navigate that. Um, and so again, I hope that everyone listening to this episode got something to take away from it and how to address it, no matter what your role is, because I mean, again, we always go in with the hope that there is an ill intent, but if there is, you know, learn, grow, change, call it out. But I think most importantly, one of the things that we try and really get at with all our episodes is really that you can avoid some of these situations when you actually center the learner.
Yeah, that part.
So if you do that, you might be on the right track.
Yeah. Ding, 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 ding.
And yeah, that's all, folks.
That's all, folks. We'll see you next time. Who knows what we're talking about?
Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the